Route 66B is a ghost track. It's a decommissioned corridor utilized exclusively by the Department of Defense for classified overland transport. It cuts directly through the longest, coldest, and emptiest dead zones of the Nevada desert. The manifest for Engine 9 departing at midnight stated 19 empty freight cars. Nothing but thousands of tons of dead weight and cold steel. But standard protocol demanded 2 armed guards stationed in the locked locomotive cabin. Their entire job was to monitor a bank of closed-circuit cameras pointed exclusively at a single target at the end of the line, Car 14. Their operational orders were absolute, printed in red ink. Keep the train moving at exactly 60 miles per hour. Maintain radio silence. Ignore all local radar anomalies. Under no circumstances pull the emergency brake. And above all else, no matter what you hear coming from the inside over the external microphones, do not attempt to open the reinforced steel door of Car 14. Private Miller broke that final rule, and when he bypassed the magnetic pneumatic seal in the middle of the desert, what he found waiting inside that lightless box wasn't classified cargo. It was alive. Sergeant Hayes was a veteran of the logistics division. He had run the ghost tracks a dozen times before. It was widely considered a punishment detail by the men. You sit in a vibrating steel cage for 400 miles of absolute nothingness, staring at a static monitor displaying the heavy exterior of a train car that never moves. Car 14 was a relic from a forgotten era. It was constructed with a thick lead lining, industrial magnetic locks on the outside, and absolutely no ventilation shafts. According to the standard logistics file handed to Hayes before departure, the car was scheduled for complete decommissioning at a black site facility. It was documented as empty. It was documented as dead space. For the first 2 hours of the journey, the operation went exactly by the book. The only sound in the cabin was the rhythmic, hypnotic beating of the heavy tracks beneath them. The desert outside the armored glass was pitch black, devoid of landmarks or moonlight. The train was a solitary bullet of steel tearing blindly through the night. But at exactly 2:14 a.m., near mile marker 84, the absolute isolation was broken. It started quietly. A minor irregularity on the thermal radar array. Private Miller, sitting across the cramped cabin from Hayes, tapped his finger against the heavy glass of the monitor. The specialized thermal sensors assigned exclusively to Car 14 were detecting a strange temperature fluctuation. A fully sealed, unventilated, empty steel vault rolling through the middle of a freezing desert at night should register as completely cold on the thermal spectrum. A dead blue mass. But the ambient temperature deep inside the center of Car 14 was climbing. It was slow, barely noticeable at first, but incredibly steady. It crept up past 50 degrees, then 60, then 80. It finally stopped and held perfectly at 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The exact, universally recognized core temperature of a living human. Or perhaps, dozens of them huddled tightly together in the dark. Hayes immediately dismissed the reading as a sensor malfunction. Lead-line train cars from that era were notoriously terrible at dissipating residual heat from previous daytime transports. He ordered Miller to ignore the glowing screen, turn off the thermal overlay, and adhere strictly to protocol. Keep the train moving. Do not engage. But 15 minutes later, the visual anomaly became an audio problem. The external communication feed crackled to life. There was a heavy-duty diagnostic microphone permanently mounted onto the exterior coupling of Car 14. It was originally engineered to detect microfractures and structural damage during high-speed transport. Instead of the low hum of the rails, the microphone picked up something else entirely. It wasn't the shifting of loose internal cargo. It wasn't wind shear. It was deliberate, mechanical in its precision. 3 heavy metallic strikes. Tap, tap, tap. Followed by a sinister 3-second pause. Then again. Tap, tap, tap. Something inside the supposedly empty pitch-black car was striking the heavy steel wall from the inside out. Private Miller's hand instinctively reached for the main comms unit to contact command regarding a breach. But Hayes swiftly grabbed his wrist, pinning it to the console. The sergeant recited the standing order verbatim. Do not investigate audio or visual disturbances. The tapping continued relentlessly. It wasn't random debris. It was a mathematical pattern. Hayes, a veteran of overseas deployments, recognized the cadence immediately. It was standard military Morse code. The universal distress signal. Miller stared at the black and white monitor, his breathing suddenly shallow in the cramped cabin. "Sarge," he whispered, his voice trembling over the roar of the engine. "The logistics log explicitly says that car is a sealed vacuum. Who is tapping?" Hayes didn't answer him. He just watched the digital speedometer lock tightly onto 60 miles per hour. As long as they didn't stop the engine, whatever was inside that impenetrable steel box was permanently trapped. That was the military theory. Until the tapping changed its rhythm. By the time they hit mile marker 112, the methodical SOS pattern abruptly stopped. The audio feed went completely dead silent for an agonizing 20 minutes. The silence was somehow significantly worse than the knocking. Then came the scratching. It didn't sound like metallic tools against steel. It sounded brutally organic. It sounded like heavy, dense fingernails dragging slowly down the interior lead lining of the walls. It wasn't localized to just one spot anymore. It sounded as though a dozen hands were simultaneously raking against the interior perimeter, testing the structural integrity of the entire car, looking for a weak seam. But the real, unfiltered terror didn't strike the cabin until the train entered the White Sands Canyon dead zone. It was a 3-mile stretch of towering, interference-heavy rock formations that completely severed their satellite communications with Command HQ. They were entirely isolated from the rest of the world. That is exactly when the voice started. The exterior safety mic suddenly picked up a vocal transmission emitting from inside Car 14. It was deeply muffled by 2 solid inches of military-spec steel, but the cadence and tone were instantly unmistakable. Someone was pleading to be let out of the dark. They were desperately begging for the train to stop. Private Miller leaned closer to the audio speaker, the blood draining completely from his face. He recognized the voice instantly. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't an unauthorized stowaway. It was Sergeant Hayes. The voice bleeding through the audio feed from inside the locked, unventilated train car at the back of the line was an exact, flawless replication of the man currently sitting directly next to him. The voice inside wept. It begged for Miller to engage the emergency brake. It cried out that it was trapped, suffocating in the absolute darkness. It used Miller's first name, a highly casual breach of protocol that the real, rigid Sergeant Hayes never, ever committed. The psychological warfare was paralyzing. Command training doctrines simply do not prepare a soldier for acoustic mimicry. The human brain cannot easily reconcile hearing its commanding officer sitting completely silent in a chair to its left, while simultaneously hearing that exact same officer screaming for salvation from inside a sealed vault hundreds of feet behind them. Private Miller's conditioning finally broke. Before Hayes could even unholster his sidearm to enforce the directive, Miller slammed his entire body weight down against the primary pneumatic emergency braking system. The massive locomotive engine violently seized. Blinding showers of bright orange sparks rained onto the desert floor as thousands of tons of forward-moving steel aggressively decelerated. The train shrieked in violent protest, throwing both armed men to the metal floor. It came to a shuddering, violent halt exactly at mile marker 140. The silence that immediately followed the chaotic braking was utterly suffocating. There was no rhythmic clacking of tracks, no roar of the diesel engine. Just the howling, freezing wind of the Nevada desert. And then, they heard the hiss. The heavy pressure seals locking Car 14 disengaged. Hayes checked his terminal in a panic. The digital readout confirmed his worst fear. The doors weren't being electronically opened from the remote terminal inside the safety of the locomotive cabin. They were being manually unlocked from the inside. Hayes grabbed his service rifle, kicked the cabin door open, and stepped out onto the freezing exterior grating. He aimed his weapon down the narrow, windy walkway connecting the long line of dark cars. 30 yards down the line, the massive steel door of Car 14 was slowly sliding open, inch by agonizing inch into the black. There was absolutely no visual footage recovered from the exterior cameras. The thermal radar system completely shorted out the very second the train's forward motion ceased. The only surviving piece of classified evidence detailing what occurred in the dark at mile marker 140 is the final, fragmented audio transmission recovered from Sergeant Hayes' localized body microphone. He didn't fire a single round from his weapon. He didn't issue a tactical order to retreat. The audio file simply captured the heavy, metallic sound of his combat boots taking 2 very slow, hesitant steps backward on the steel grating. Then, a voice echoing out from the open, black void of Car 14 pierced the night. It sounded exactly like Hayes, but heavily distorted and unnaturally layered. as if the exact same sentence was being spoken by 24 separate throats simultaneously in perfect unison. The transmission ended with a sharp, violent burst of electrical static. Then permanent silence. Classified Federal recovery teams located Engine 9 purely by satellite tracking 6 hours later. It was left idling perfectly on the tracks. The heavy steel door to Car 14 was wide open. Advanced tactical teams breached the perimeter, but the interior was completely barren. Not a single trace of organic material, blood, or clothing was recovered. However, forensic analysis noted that the thick lead lining on the interior walls bore deep, violent, overlapping scratch marks. Thousands of them. And every single groove was angled violently toward the exit door. Sergeant Hayes and Private Miller were never found. They were officially and permanently listed as missing in action due to a logistical equipment malfunction. In the Federal Archives, the manifest was quietly altered to reflect absolute, flawless adherence to transport protocol. Some restricted cargo isn't meant to ever reach a final destination. In some cases, the perpetual, unstoppable movement of the train is the only protocol actually keeping the nightmare contained. A Warbound Journal story.